Sequels are a pretty bizarre thing. Whether we're talking about video games, movies, or even books, sequels could be a source of worry and anxiety for some. And that's because in a lot of cases, the phrase "a sequel is never as good as the original" rings true. Sure, in the world of gaming we have exceptions to that rule, like Sonic 2, Mega Man 2 and Ratchet & Clank going commando. But even with those examples, there are plenty of games that prove that theory, particularly in the form of NES sequels. Mario 2, Castlevania 2, Final Fantasy 2, all of these games are polarising to longtime fans, even today. And that's mostly because those examples tried to do something way too different, way too early in the franchise's history. Today's game, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, fits into that category perfectly. Over the years I've heard people swear up and down that this game was horrible, that it was the worst Zelda game, if not the worst NES game altogether. Moreover, I was told at every turn to avoid this game like the fucking plague. But I decided to give it a look and see for myself if it's truly as bad as people say it is.
First things first, a plot. After the defeat of Ganon in the original game, Zelda's put under sleeping spell after some kind of dispute. To break the spell, Link must locate the Triforce of Courage, located in the Great Palace. To aid him in his quest, Impa gives him 6 crystals that act as keys to the palace, once placed in 6 smaller palaces. With your objective clear, you set out on your adventure, and it's in this starting screen you immediately realise why this game is the black sheep of the franchise. Zelda 2 is predominantly a side-scroller. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but with such a stark contrast between the top-down style of 1 and the side-scrolling action of this game, it's no wonder it alienated a lot of people. On top of being a side-scroller, this game is also an RPG. This makes the change even greater, since with an RPG come RPG elements, such as a magic meter and a leveling system which allows you to upgrade your stats once you gain a level.
Despite plenty of complaints about the system over the years, I was pleasantly surprised by how well it worked at giving you a sense of growth and improvement. Granted, it's a very standard and bare bones leveling up system that basically every role-playing game employs in some capacity, so it shouldn't be too surprising.
Another thing this game does that's congruent with other RPGs is making the increase in levels earned via engaging in battle with enemies and earning experience points. Enemies can be found all over the place, especially in palaces and cave areas. They can be found in the overworld too, which, now I think about it, is a little more reminiscent of the previous game with its top-down perspective. But if you're in a pinch and need to get away, overworld enemies are usually easily avoided. However, you won't be as lucky when you encounter enemies in the aforementioned dungeons. I'm not sure what it is, but enemies are a lot harder to avoid in these sections, and can take you out without much effort. Perhaps it's because areas like the palaces are a lot more cramped and force you to engage with the enemies. You have to be careful when battling these enemies though, because EXP is lost once you get a game over. And not only that, there are some enemies that can steal your EXP, and in some cases drain your magic meter. This sucks because most of the game is designed around the use of spells that you learn while visiting the towns of this game. Some spells help you progress, some help you uncover secrets, and some heal you. And without the ability to use these spells, a lot of the time you're a sitting duck. Of course, most of the game can be beaten with raw skill and a bit of luck on the odd occasion, but especially later in the game when these types of enemies become more present, this becomes a real pain and can make the game way harder than it needs to be. This brings me to one of the main complaints about this game: the difficulty. A lot of people claim this to be the hardest Zelda game, and honestly I can't disagree. Most other Zelda games are pretty forgiving for the most part, but this game is pretty challenging. However, I would like to stress this game isn't necessarily as hard or as unforgiving as many make it out to be. Sure, you have plenty of annoying and unfair areas, even earlier in the game, like the infamous Death Mountain, but largely the game gives you a decent margin of error when it comes to enemy attacks and other obstacles. But the game can still be very, very unfair. I'd say from the Ocean Palace onwards is when things get really ridiculous. This game develops some kind of fetish for spamming enemies at you during the most unfair situations, very rarely letting up and giving you space to breathe. It's just enemy after enemy after enemy. The road to the Great Palace is probably the worst offender. As soon as you set foot in the vicinity, you're met with Lizalfos hurling rocks at you. Why are these lizards trying to stone me? I feel like a gay guy in Saudi Arabia. And don't get me started on the Great Palace itself. Some of the enemies here are ridiculous and are just better avoided if you can manage. And then when you get to the end, you're met by the Thunderbird, who who can only be damaged after you use a thunder spell on it, a spell which depletes most of your magic meter, leaving you with nowhere near enough magic to use a life spell to heal up. Then to top it all off, you're met with the final boss of this game, Dark Link. This boss is iconic for many reasons, one of which being the fact it's hard as balls if you decide to tackle it the way it was intended to be. But since I'm a little bitch, I just use a crouching exploit because I was just done with this game by the time I got to the final dungeon. Not because I was sick of the cheap shit the game throws at you by the end or anything like that, but just because the game got kinda tiresome.
There's no better way to explain it other than I was bored. With none of the puzzles and secrets to uncover that have become trademarks of the Zelda franchise to break up the somewhat repetitive town, dungeon formula, I just wanted to move on and play something else ASAP. Sure, there were some secrets, but they weren't really satisfying to uncover, and 9 times out of 10 required help from a guide. And I'm not a fan of guide games. I suppose that's another complaint some folks have about the game. It's just way too cryptic sometimes.
The original Zelda game was a guide game too, but this game is basically on the same level, if not worse at times. The formula is fairly easy to understand, but sometimes you'll need to figure something out in order to learn a new spell or gain a new ability, and oftentimes it's something you'd have no way of knowing about without help from an outside source. It kinda adds to the quote-unquote difficulty of this game, and I put difficulty in quotations because it's not so much difficulty as much as it is a test of your patience. For example, as I mentioned earlier in the video, when you get a game over, you'll lose some of the XP you earn from fighting enemies. But that's not all that happens when you get a game over. You also get sent all the way back to Hyrule Castle, being forced to trek your way back. Unless you're at the Great Palace, that is, in which case you're sent back to the entrance because the game just decides it wants to take pity on you all of a sudden. Luckily, this game is fairly linear, so if you die outside the Great Palace after familiarising yourself with the overworld a bit, you shouldn't have too much trouble getting back to where you last died. Thankfully, familiarising yourself with the overworld isn't too hard, since the graphics are a lot better this time around, and the environments look a lot less samey. That's not to say Zelda 1 looks bad by any means. Honestly, I'm kinda nostalgic for the first Zelda game and its art style, but I think The Adventure of Link does a better job at conveying a difference in scenery, as well as what things are to begin with. Also, a benefit of the side-scroller approach is that the enemies look a lot more intimidating, since things are a lot closer, allowing for more detail. The music in this game is also great. While it's not the most memorable soundtrack in the franchise, there are some bangers here. The Palace theme is a standout track everyone remembers, and for good reason. It's great. I love it and can definitely see why it spawned multiple remixes over the years.
My feelings towards Zelda 2 are very mixed, because while there are good elements here like the combat and the RPG-like system, the unnecessary difficulty and the cryptic bullshit present stops you from being a wholly fun experience. Add on to that a lack of many things that would become series staples like the puzzles and rupees, and you have a decent game that, despite the name on the box, doesn't really feel like a Zelda game. If anything, with the side-on perspective and all the unfair and cryptic bullshit, it feels more like a Lost King's Quest game than anything. But with all that said, I still refuse to call The Adventure of Link a bad game. The game overall works well and is fair when it needs to be. It's just a product of its time. Although, I don't think I could recommend this game to anyone. If you're a Zelda fan, I recommend you skip this entry unless you really like a challenge or just want to play every entry for the sake of completion. Also quickly, just before I go, this very well might be the very last video I do in this house. If not, it might be the next one. It's been a wild ride in this house, but I finally got my own space, which means possibly more consistency. And yeah, I'm really happy about it, but videos might be a little slow after I move or after I'm settled in. So yeah, I'll look forward to seeing you once I move in, and yeah, please like, subscribe, do all that good shit, and peace.